Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. It is 1 p.m. and you are on a webinar entitled Recovery While Incarcerated and Purposeful Incarceration. Today we're going to discuss those two initiatives from the Indiana Department of Correction and how that interfaces with your role as a community supervision or community treatment provider. A few housekeeping notes. We ask that you please mute your phone as there are a large number of people on this call. If your phone does not have a mute feature on it, please go ahead and hit *6 on your phone, and that will mute the phone line for you. But we really do want to make sure that everybody has their line muted. In addition, we are recording this presentation, and as of right now, you are being recorded. And so if you're not on mute, we get to record all of your fun conversations you don't intend for us to hear. We are recording it so that other people who could not attend the live webinar could maybe benefit from hearing this information at a later date. There is a feature on your control panel of the webinar that allows you to ask questions. My name is Stephanie Spoolstra. I'm the Executive Director of Addiction Recovery for the Indiana Department of Correction. I also have David Reed here with me. Mr. Reed is our Assistant Director of Addiction Recovery, and he will be manning the question inbox. So as you ask questions, he will be answering them, and we will have time to review all of those questions and answers at the end of today's webinar. Again, we ask that you maintain your line on mute and ask questions using this feature rather than the phone call feature, as we have over 100 attendees participating in the call today. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So today during this presentation, we are going to discuss the changes to Indiana Department of Corrections Addiction Recovery Services, now to be known as Recovery While Incarcerated. We're going to review the basics of purposeful incarceration and also review how RWI impacts purposeful incarceration. We will be looking at how purposeful incarceration and recovery while incarcerated interact with community supervision strategies and how they are influenced by reentry. And if you're talking about an email being sent, we just heard you because your line is not on mute. So a reminder to everybody on the call, please mute your lines. We're not trying to be rude. We just want to make sure everybody can benefit from hearing what they need to hear on this and not your personal or work conversations. Thank you so much. So the Recovery While Incarcerated initiative is rolling out at the Indiana Department of Corrections. What that means is that existing addiction recovery service models that have traditionally been used at IDOC are now being replaced. To answer your question, yes, this eliminates the therapeutic community model, including synonyms of the GRIP, TC, or CLIF units. There will be one remaining therapeutic community treatment program in the state, and that will be at the Stark County Regional Program. Other than that, all other therapeutic communities will be transformed into our new treatment model called Recovery While Incarcerated, or RWI. We are doing this as a strategic rollout, and it will be happening. It started happening in September of this past year and will continue through June 30th of 2018. So you may see or hear from offenders who may not have been enrolled in RWI just yet, depending on what facility they are at. As of December 31st of this year, we will have begun rollout or have already implemented rollout at several of our facilities, including the Indiana State Prison, Westville Correctional Facility, Miami Correctional Facility, Indiana Women's Prison, Pendleton Correctional Facility, and Correctional Industrial Facility. Again, we hope to have it rolled out to all adult facilities by June 30th of 2018. Existing treatment will remain in place until we transform them. So TC models may still remain in place at those sites we've not yet implemented our new program. The RWI project really seeks to transform the way we provide addiction recovery services at the Department of Correction. It just really responds to Governor Holcomb's call for action when he named the addiction epidemic as one of the top and key pillars that he wants to address during his administration. It addresses the shift in population criminogenic risk that we've seen at the Department of Correction and the shift in clinical needs as a result of House Enrolled Act 106. And finally, and most importantly, it shifts the culture of corrections towards a recovery-oriented system that views addiction as a disease. As we get into what all of the details of these changes look like, you will see that the Department of Correction is truly committed to addressing addiction as a disease rather than as a character flaw. This means that we don't ask offenders to sit in their addiction for 50 years anymore before we provide them treatment, but rather provide them treatment right from the day they walk in the door. Some of the key goals related to RWI are listed on your screen now. First and foremost, we'd like to provide the right treatment at the right place at the right time. We really want our offenders to have access to addiction treatment when they need it, where they need it, and where they are at that moment. This means implementing all new programming at facilities that have had very minimal treatment in the past, such as our maximum security locations at the Indiana State Prison, Pendleton Correctional Facility, Wabash Correctional Facility, Indiana Women's Prison, and Miami Correctional Facility. We also are developing a full continuum of care. And what we mean by that is in the past, we had two models of treatment. We had the therapeutic community, which was a very intensive, minimum of 8-month residential treatment program, or we had a very light treatment program called outpatient, which constituted of a maximum of 4 hours a week of treatment. As we develop the new RWI program, we have developed a full continuum of care that meets the severity and the intensity of need of each individual offender. We'll go into the specifics of what that continuum of care looks like later on in this presentation. Another goal of RWI is to provide a recovery-based environment that promotes structure, accountability, development of coping skills, and emotional support for offenders seeking change in recovery. What this looks like in the flesh is that we are really educating and providing training to all Department of Corrections staff, from line staff to correctional officers to administration, to addiction recovery staff, to our medical services provider. Everybody is getting more and more education, information, and help on how to meaningfully address addiction within our offender population and the important role that we play in addressing the addiction epidemic in Indiana. Finally, our last goal is to individualize treatment curriculums to address both the individual offender's needs for treatment, to prepare them for successful reentry into the community, and also to address the needs of our facilities related to treatment. So when we talk about individualizing treatment curriculums, we really mean two different things. One is we will be providing individualized treatment based on each individual offender's assessment, screening tools, and presentation. We will give them the right dose of treatment for their specific presentation. Additionally, the Recovery While Incarcerated project has a framework that every facility will follow, but is also malleable enough that each facility will be able to individualize it to what their culture and their facility needs at the time of treatment. Listed on your screen are some of the key features of the RWI project. I won't read all of these to you today, but I am going to highlight just a few of them here. One of our things that we're most excited about is that we have eliminated earliest possible release date restrictions. In the past, Department of Correction policy limited referral to addiction treatment to an offender who was within the last 36 months of their incarceration period and not after they were within 14 months. So again, it limited to between 36 months and 14 months of their release. Addiction recovery was really viewed as a reentry strategy rather than as a clinical treatment paradigm. In the rollout of RWI, we've actually not only eliminated those earliest possible release date restrictions, but have trained staff in saying that addiction recovery is considered a priority referral, and the sooner it can occur within one's incarceration period, the better. We've also implemented new screening and assessment processes, which I will detail on the next couple slides, and a more comprehensive medication-assisted treatment program as clinically indicated for individual offenders. We've updated all of our curriculum and really encouraged the use of 12-step and volunteer-led groups as well within each facility. Let's talk about our new screening and assessment process. In the past, we often got inquiries asking how many offenders came to the Department of Correction with a substance use disorder, and we didn't always have the best way to figure that out. With our new screening and assessment process, all offenders entering into the Department of Correction system are now screened for the potential presence of a substance use disorder at their intake facility. This is not unlike a screening that you might encounter when you go to your primary care physician's office. It's a brief questionnaire that takes 7 to 8 minutes and allows our intake facility addiction recovery staff to discern whether or not someone is likely to have developed a school substance use disorder prior to being incarcerated. After that screening tool has been completed, it helps us then allow case management processes know whether or not they need to be referred for a full clinical assessment. After someone has been screened and they've been indicated as likely needing more treatment, they receive a full intake assessment by addiction recovery staff. That assessment then determines the severity of an offender's problematic substance use and/or confirms their substance use disorder. It identifies their addiction recovery treatment needs and also assesses their readiness and willingness to engage in treatment. So to get more detailed on what this looks like, we rolled out the screening process in July of 2017 of this year. So as of July of this year, every new offender has been screened when they came to our intake facility for the presence of a substance use and mental health disorder using our new screening tool. Our initial results were quite interesting. What we found for male offenders was that about 90% of them have minimally met the threshold of having a history of problematic substance use in their past, meaning they're at least more susceptible to a substance use disorder. If we get more tight on what those screening tools told us, 60% of all entering male offenders screened as likely to have a substance use disorder and really need targeted treatment. This becomes even more relevant when we look at our purposefully incarcerated offenders, which is what this webinar is ultimately about today. Between 40 and 55%, and that's a range due to that varies based on gender and level of risk of those coming in. 40 to 55% of all PI offenders screened as likely to have a substance use disorder. That also means that as many as 60% of those purposefully incarcerated do not qualify as being diagnosed for a substance use disorder, nor qualify for needing clinical treatment. When an offender has screened as being likely of having a substance use disorder, we will be implementing a new comprehensive assessment tool. This will be rolling out as of January 2018 and will be a slow rollout throughout the state. But this new comprehensive assessment tool we'll be using is called the Drug Use Screening Inventory Revised, or the DUCR. This assessment tool shows an overall problem density score as well as 10 domain scores that help us identify how severe an offender's issues are with substance use disorders, mental health diagnoses, problems with family, problems with criminogenic risk, and other key factors that impact one's ability to find recovery. The overall scores will help our addiction recovery staff prescribe the intensity of treatment an individual offender might need. We also refer to that intensity of treatment as modality, and when I get further into what RWI looks like, you'll hear the term modality again. The DUCR will also be used at regular intervals to review and demonstrate movement and core competencies related to recovery. This assessment tool allows us to see both progress and regression in one's recovery skills and in other core competencies that help influence their own recovery and their process towards recovery. Another core component that we are adding as part of the Recovery While Incarcerated project is the sober living environment, or the SLE. The sober living environment replaces in many facilities what was previously a therapeutic community. In other facilities, it's a brand new housing unit that has been moved around and designated specifically and exclusively for those offenders who are enrolled in addiction recovery RWI services. The sober living environment really looks like what we see in the community in the forms of residential housing or sober living housing or halfway houses. Whereas everybody that is living in the sober living environment, in that housing unit, pod, or dorm, is all in some phase or stage of working towards their own individual recovery and actively enrolled in treatment. Some offenders may be on day 1 of actively working on their recovery, while other offenders may be on day 500. Regardless, that environment really promotes recovery in each individual offender and supports a better controlled recovery environment for everyone there, working towards a common goal. At some facilities, you may hear that the sober living environment is co-located with other character programs, such as our Plus unit or our ICAM program. Our hope is that by co-locating them with other programs that are considered programs of high quality, we will be able to promote recovery rather than expose our people enrolled in recovery while incarcerated into general population and additional criminogenic risk. The RWI framework requires you to be familiar with 2 really important terms. On the left-hand side of your screen, we use the word continuum and modality pretty interchangeably in RWI. What we're referring to there is the intensity, dose, or frequency of service. How often is this individual going to be seen and worked with by an individual addiction recovery staff provider? In the new RWI framework, we have 4 distinct modalities or intensities of service. And placement in those intensities are determined by the severity index on their assessment scores. The term progression is used to help identify how far along an offender is within their competency related to recovery skills. Progressions are matched up with stages of change and again are really, sorry, if you're talking right now, can you please put your line on mute as we can hear you? Thank you so much. Progression, as offenders move through progressions, they will be asked to demonstrate specific competencies in each area to demonstrate their recovery skills. There are 6 total progressions, and every offender will be asked to demonstrate mastery of each progression before moving to the next. On this slide, you can see what our treatment continuum looks like, or our 4 different modalities. On the left-hand side of your screen, we identify the most intensive services, moving to our least intensive services as you go to your right. The recovery-oriented community, or the ROC as we call it, is our most intensive service modality. Offenders who are enrolled in a ROC level of treatment have scored most severe on our assessment tools and really need 40 hours a week more of intensive guided treatment. Offenders enrolled in the recovery-oriented community can expect to be provided a lot of support via group sessions, individual sessions, as well as volunteer-led groups and 12-step programs. Stepping down from there, our moderate severity of need would be placed into the intensive outpatient or IOP program within a DOC facility. Offenders enrolled in the IOP program will face on average 15 to 20 hours a week of guided treatment. They will also be expected to work in volunteer-led groups and other volunteer opportunities to continue their journey into recovery. Moving down, our outpatient services program is very similar to what we've provided in the past. Offenders in outpatient services will receive between 4 to 10 hours a week in treatment services. Also, while they're in outpatient services, it is the expectation that the majority of enrolled offenders in outpatient or below will also begin engaging further in the community within the facility by working an outside job and having more opportunities to interact with offenders not seeking recovery. Our goal there is so that we can allow offenders to better reintegrate to a more realistic society that they may face upon reentry, where the rest of the world is not all in recovery like them. It gives them opportunities to go back and have guided processing and clinical interventions while being exposed to opportunities that may cause relapse and getting them to practice their recovery skills. Our final component, and one that I'm most excited about, is the relapse prevention program. Offenders enrolled in relapse prevention will receive between 2 hours a week to 2 hours a month, depending on need, of continued treatment. And when we removed the time restrictions for when somebody could access addiction treatment, we really needed to provide an opportunity for them to continue in care no matter how long they were incarcerated with us. The relapse prevention is our vehicle for doing that. An offender can remain in relapse prevention for 50 years, should that be how long they're with us. But it's a way for them to continue to be in touch with their community, to be in touch with recovery, and have a place that they can go to continue to work with professional staff as needed. We are also implementing a more robust medication-assisted treatment program at the Department of Correction. Historically, we had a very small reentry pilot focusing just on parolees who were coming out of our correctional facilities, providing them with a pre-release injection of naltrexone, also known as Vivitrol, and connecting them to care and treatment upon release so they could continue on that medication-assisted treatment. By limiting it to parolees and really not expanding the access to other forms of naltrexone, we really did not have great outcomes or interest in that program. After review of it and other evidence-based practices going on across the United States, the RWI project has expanded on MAT greatly within the Department of Correction. Now, at any point in time, any offender can receive oral naltrexone or Revia when it's clinically indicated. This is a daily dose medication that blocks the receptor sites for opioid or alcohol receptors, impacting one's ability to feel high or euphoric effects from opioids and reduces cravings for those who may still experience cravings for their substances. This can happen and be administered to an offender at any point in time, and they can be maintained on that medication for however long is clinically indicated and determined to be appropriate with the offender and their treatment provider. We expanded our reentry project to include all offenders, not just those on parolee, and to include a protocol that starts medication earlier on pre-release. So an offender identified as interested in getting a Vivitrol injection pre-release will be allowed to commence services 60 days pre-release using oral naltrexone to start catching those reentry jitters that begin to happen before they're asked to get that injection. We oftentimes heard feedback from offenders that their relapse dreams and their ideas of relapse occurred well before the week before their release date. By offering them assistance medically to address those physical cravings and those relapse dreams ahead of time, our hope is that more offenders will be interested and see Vivitrol or continued oral naltrexone as a viable option to support their recovery upon release to the community. We also, with the start of our new medical services contract with Wexford Health Systems, were able to hire an addiction recovery reentry coordinator. Jason Harvey is our reentry coordinator in addiction recovery, and Mr. Harvey has been working hard reaching out to community service providers and following up with offenders being released on MAT to ensure continuity of care and access to continuous appointments and recovery services. Now that you have a framework of all of the changes happening within our treatment services program, I want to talk to you about how that impacts purposeful incarceration and why that's so important for those of you providing community supervision or treatment within our communities. Purposeful Incarceration was an initiative that was created to foster a relationship between the Indiana Department of Correction and the judicial system. It really helped offer a resource for judges who are identifying people coming into their courtrooms whose primary reason for violating the law was their substance use disorder. It allowed them to get quick access to treatment that was comprehensive and really helped that offender long-term find recovery so that they were less likely to engage in criminal behaviors in the future. We utilized evidence-based practices for reentry strategies that improved community safety, reentry outcomes, and access to treatment as we developed purposeful incarceration. And one of the most critical components of purposeful incarceration was the commitment from the courtroom to evaluate and consider a sentence modification when an offender successfully completed addiction treatment services within the Department of Correction. This is a critical component of this evidence-based practice, as the sooner we are able to get them out of the Department of Correction, the less exposure to additional criminogenic risk they face, and the better they do in reintegrating into their community. We also know that an offender finds more meaningful recovery in their place of home and where they're going to live than outside of their community. Historically, we utilized the therapeutic community treatment model to meet the expectations of completing treatment at the Department of Correction. So an offender would be sentenced under a purposeful incarceration order, and they would successfully complete the therapeutic community treatment model in order to be considered for sentence modification. Unfortunately, this very much so limited access to care to those facilities where a therapeutic community was located. With the rollout of RWI, treatment will be available at every DOC facility, thus allowing one who's purposefully incarcerated to be placed wherever is most appropriate for them and in the most appropriate care at the facility where they reside. Second, the historical component of this created myths that only offenders who were purposefully incarcerated would be given access to addiction recovery services. And so we began to get an influx of purposely incarcerated offenders who really would not be considered for sentence modification, but the sentencing judge really just wanted them to access treatment. This led to a significant backup of wait lists within the Department of Corrections, sometimes exceeding 100 people at an individual facility waiting to get into addiction recovery treatment. It also made it nearly impossible at those facilities for offenders who did not have a purposeful incarceration order to get access to treatment, even if they needed it. As a result of this information and other pieces of information, we made changes to the treatment we provided and also the PI initiative. We gained that feedback from judges, prosecuting and defense attorneys, and community supervision providers. We reviewed recidivism and modification data for all of those PI offenders across the state, asked for recommendations from facility administration, facility staff, and addiction recovery clinicians, and completed a complete analysis of the impact of PI on the access to care. Here is just one bit of data that helped inform the changes we are making to purposeful incarceration. In calendar year 2016, we had 3,322 offenders successfully complete treatment under a purposeful incarceration order. That does not include those who did not successfully complete. We had many more orders for PI that also did not successfully complete. But of those who successfully completed, the 3,300 plus, only 37% of them were modified to a community supervision strategy. In contrast, over 2,000 offenders who successfully completed their treatment remained with the Indiana Department of Correction to complete their sentence, were not modified, and faced additional exposure to criminogenic risk and criminal thinking by remaining within the Department of Correction. This also created backup for beds, as the historical model was to maintain somebody on the therapeutic community until they were released. We could no longer do that when we had over 2,000 offenders successfully completing. They could no longer sit in those beds in order for other offenders to be able to have access to care. One of the key changes, as you could probably anticipate coming, was how we provide admission into recovery while incarcerated for all IDOC offenders. First and foremost, we consider addiction needs as the #1 priority, and we screen and assess the needs of those offenders, and those needing treatment the most will be given priority admission to recovery while incarcerated. Particularly, clinical severity will be our #1 priority, and those who demonstrate their chronic relapsing brain disease needs immediate treatment will be given admission regardless of their purposeful incarceration status. A PI designation is truly just for those offenders whose judges would consider a modification of sentence when they are completing treatment. The PI designation is just one component now for consideration into entrance of treatment. Where it does continue to benefit to mark somebody as purposefully incarcerated are for those who you intend to modify out, as you will be given increased reporting and offenders will be waived from other expectations of programs that they must complete prior to attending addiction recovery services. To be more specific, your non-PI offender will be asked immediately to attend educational services, so they must obtain their GED, TASC, or a minimum of a 9th grade reading level before they're eligible for any other services within the Department of Correction, including addiction recovery services. That there is some waivers to that rule for those who are clinically needing treatment earlier on. However, it is best practice for someone to be able to be literate, to be able to participate in our treatment services. From that point, a non-PI offender would be expected to be immediately referred to addiction recovery services after they've received their educational services. It remains a priority referral that way, but also make sure that we prioritize education, which we know is a huge resiliency factor for reentry. For those offenders with a PI designation, we will not be asking them to go to minimum education services prior to referral to addiction recovery services. A PI designation does allow for a faster track to addiction recovery services, with the expectation that it also allows for a faster track for reentry into the community. We have also then, because of the RWI model, determined that individuals will be enrolled in the most clinically appropriate modality of treatment. This one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach is no longer going to be the way of addiction recovery. In the past, people were put into therapeutic community whether their clinical severity indicated or not, just because they were purposefully incarcerated. In the future, offenders will be able to complete their purposeful incarceration requirements by finishing whatever clinically indicated addiction recovery treatment program has been prescribed to them. This results in new language going in the abstract of judgments or the sentencing orders for courts. And that new abstract language says, upon successful completion of the clinically indicated appropriate substance abuse treatment program, as determined by the Indiana Department of Correction, the court will consider a modification to this sentence. We've also begun to clarify the difference between a purposeful incarceration recommendation and a purposeful incarceration designation. The sentencing court is responsible for making a recommendation that an offender be purposefully incarcerated via their abstract of judgment or sentencing order. This recommendation for PI does not mean that an offender will automatically be enrolled in addiction recovery treatment services. Instead, the final designation of an offender for PI is made by IDOC addiction recovery staff after they've completed a full clinical screening and assessment. Offenders who qualify and are designated for PI must meet clinical eligibility criteria based on their severity of substance use and recovery needs in order to qualify for enrollment in any addiction treatment recovery program. They must also meet administrative eligibility requirements to be eligible. This includes conduct and behavior expectations within the facility, and they cannot be designated as purposefully incarcerated if they're one of the statutorily uneligible offenses for sentence modification. We also want to reiterate that addiction treatment is a voluntary treatment program. This doesn't mean that offenders who need treatment do not face consequences within the department for not enrolling in treatment or not agreeing to participate in treatment, but it also means that we will long-term not force them to do so unless there's a civil commitment saying they must participate in treatment. What we really did here by separating out the idea of recommendation and designation is took some of the weight off the shoulders of the judges that we heard from so often that said they were not sure whether or not a person had a substance use disorder, that they were not clinicians and did not want the full responsibility of making that clinical judgment, but they did want to wave a red flag and say, hey, check this guy or girl out and make an assessment and tell me, is this person needing treatment? And if so, when they complete, I will complete a sentence modification. Another benefit to flagging someone as PI or designating them as PI, once they've been designated and assessed clinically as appropriate for treatment, the court can expect some standardization in communication. The Department of Correction heard a lot of feedback that they were getting different reports or not getting the reports, or there were inconsistencies in the information being received. We have worked really hard to standardize that communication, and you will now be seeing letters for successful and unsuccessful completion of treatment that are very standardized across all DOC facilities. With those letters will come attachments that include a treatment summary of someone's progress through clinical treatment and a case management progress report that demonstrates what programs they have successfully completed while within the Department of Correction. The majority of PI-related communication also now has shifted from our case management staff to our addiction recovery services directors. This provides the courts direct access to those providing the treatment services when they should have questions. We want to highlight the importance of what you're seeing when you see a case management progress report in light of time credits. Please be aware that the application of statutorily required addiction recovery time credits are in no way related to the eligibility for modification of sentence by the court. And often, when you get your case management progress reports, you may see that offenders successfully completed a program, but may not see the application of the time credit that they may or may not have earned by completing the program. Those application of time credits sometimes take more time than it takes for us to get you the progress report or to submit to you a successful completion letter. Please note that their eligibility for sentence modification does not change based on their eligibility for time credit within the DOC or the application of that time credit. We want you to also know that treatment will start as early as possible within one sentence, and that is regardless of orders that request an offender to serve a minimum amount of time before considering a modification. For example, we often get sentence orders that read, this offender is sentenced under Purposeful Incarceration Initiative, and we will consider sentence modification after they've successfully completed treatment after 5 years of incarceration. When we moved from a disease treatment model in the treatment of addiction, we decided that it would be considered medical malpractice to ignore the treatment of one's disease in lieu of a court order that said a sentence modification would not be eligible until somebody had served a minimum time. We have done a great job, however, in being able to provide continuing service by adding the relapse prevention component of our program. Therefore, offenders who have orders that look like that will still be enrolled in addiction recovery services right from the beginning. And for judges who choose to not modify their sentence until they've served a minimum amount of time, they will be eligible to remain in addiction recovery services throughout that period of time. However, we don't ask an offender who comes in with diabetes to wait 5 years before we treat their diabetes and provide them insulin and other behavior ways to manage their diabetes. We will no longer be doing that for addiction recovery services either. And finally, and this was huge feedback that we received from lots of different stakeholders, we are committed to providing ongoing education to judges, attorneys, and other key stakeholders related to purposeful incarceration and to addiction recovery services at the Department of Correction. In the past, we have provided information, but the ability for us to provide ongoing education, particularly to new judges and new attorneys, has not happened related to purposeful incarceration, which has led to a lot of myths and backups in our program. We are committed to fixing that and remedying that and being available to you to be a resource related to purposeful incarceration in the future. If you have questions about purposeful incarceration, or you'd like David or I to come and speak to your particular event, we are more than happy to be there and would love to hear back from you on how we can be more helpful. I want to highlight some summary points of what purposeful incarceration is and is not, and then go through some frequently asked questions and talk about why community supervision is so important. Purposeful incarceration is a collaborative initiative between the Department of Correction and the courts and considered a recommendation for addiction recovery clinical assessment. It is an initiative that is designed for someone whose criminal behavior is related to a chronic relapsing brain disease. It is a way for the courts to receive increased communication about an offender's participation in addiction recovery service, and it's a tool for the DOC and the courts to reduce exposure to increased criminogenic risk through modification of sentence. It is not indicated for somebody with antisocial personality disorder traits or someone whose criminal behavior is predatory in nature. And our new clinical assessment tools are able to differentiate those offenders out. So we are definitely sending notification in those cases when somebody is not clinically appropriate. It is not considered a direct admission into RWI, but rather a direct admission for assessment. And then that assessment will dictate whether or not somebody is appropriate for treatment. It is not an automatic sentence modification. I can't tell you how many times I've heard from an offender that he is entitled to a sentence modification because he successfully completed treatment. That remains at the discretion of the individual court and judge as to whether or not that sentence modification occurs. Purposeful incarceration is not considered a first line of treatment for someone with a substance use disorder. When appropriate within sentencing guidelines, it is evidence-based practice that an offender try to receive community supervision strategies linked with community treatment prior to coming to the Department of Correction. Purposeful incarceration is truly for those individuals who are not successful in those strategies within the community. And finally, we want to note that purposeful incarceration does not guarantee a lifetime of recovery. Those who are faced with the challenges of the chronic relapsing brain disease of addiction may relapse. And while we think our treatment that we provide is excellent, we don't guarantee that they won't be facing additional exposure to drugs and alcohol that may cause relapse in the future, or may cause a relapse in their criminal thinking or criminal behavior. Let's go over some frequently asked questions, and then we will review community supervision and why it's so important. One question we often get asked is, what is the minimum length of time for a PI sentence? The answer is that there is no minimum length of time, although it's recommended that an offender have a sentence of at least 5 years in order to increase motivation for change and recovery. We want the offender to have plenty of time to complete their addiction recovery services and also reap the benefits of a sentence modification where they can continue to be monitored in the community. If a sentence is too short, the Purposeful Incarceration Initiative does not allow for a sentence modification and therefore isn't necessary. We will be sure to provide treatment to those offenders who are there for a shorter period of time should they clinically need it. They just don't need to be purposefully incarcerated, as they will not be eligible for a modification. They will be released before that happens. How long does the RWI program take to complete? Unlike the therapeutic community, there is no minimum or maximum amount of time it takes to complete treatment. In the past, the therapeutic community took a minimum of 8 months and a maximum generally of 12 months. We saw on average it took most offenders 10 months to complete the therapeutic community. However, in the RWI program, treatment and progress within treatment is really led by the offender rather than time. And it's contingent on the individual offender's ability to learn and demonstrate skills related to recovery. In essence, the answer to that question is the RWI program takes the offender however long they choose to make it take. An offender who is highly motivated and willing to practice and demonstrate recovery skills will move through and complete treatment much quicker than an offender who denies their substance use disorder or is not willing to practice or demonstrate skills. Does the IDOC recommend a modification for immediate release upon completion? The answer is no. DOC requests that a sentence modification upon successful completion provides the department with 30 days for release reentry planning. When we do release reentry planning, we make provisions for continued treatment, continued linkage to medication-assisted treatment, appropriate housing, identification paperwork such as Social Security cards, birth certificates, and state IDs, applications for Medicaid and HIP 2.0, and referral for recovery work for ongoing treatment. It is so important that we release our offenders with a step ahead rather than a step back. And by giving us those 30 days to ensure they have all of these additional bits and components that they are more successful for reentry, it will really help us out and your offender out in the long run. Is a purposeful incarceration designation the only way an offender can be referred to RWI or Addiction Recovery Service? The answer is no. Addiction Recovery Services and RWI are now considered a priority program for all IDOC offenders. RWI referrals will occur for all IDOC offenders presenting with a clinical need after they successfully complete minimum education requirements. Those who are purposefully incarcerated will be waived the minimum education requirements and will be expected to be considered for sentence modification upon successful completion. Can an offender do another IDOC program for purposeful incarceration, like the PLUS program or DOL? Indiana law truly allows a judge to modify a sentence for any reason, and that's not at the discretion of the DOC. However, the DOC Purposeful Incarceration Initiative is only focused on addressing addiction recovery services. We ask that PI designation are for those offenders who you believe have a substance use disorder and without that disorder would not behave criminally, so that we can provide them the appropriate addiction recovery services to decrease their risk for future criminal behavior. Programs like PLUS and DOL are excellent programs and really do also decrease recidivism, but not recidivism specific to substance use disorders. Is there any evidence of what reduces recidivism in those who have completed and are modified? The answer is yes. Evidence-based practices suggest that modifying an offender to a community supervision strategy and/or titrated reintegration into the community decreases the likelihood for recidivism as opposed to those related without continued supervision by the court. I want to spend more time on this because those on this call are really those partners who provide those reentry and community supervision strategies. We believe that connections to the community are key in reducing recidivism and helping an offender find long-term recovery. We've seen evidence of this in two recent studies. One is in Recovery Works one-year evaluation. And Recovery Works one-year evaluation found that the reincarceration rate for DOC offenders 1 year of services after those released from the Department of Correction and received ongoing services, the recidivism rate was 13.8%. That is significantly reduced from what we see for general population releases within 1 year of release. In Vanderburgh County, they did a study with the Vanderburgh County Treatment Court, and it looked at releases from 2005 to 2016 and did a more traditional 3-year return study for recidivism. The 3-year recidivism rate after successfully completing a specialty court was only 12%. This is a phenomenal number when we compare that to general population releases that are in the 30 to 40% range. Those who re-enter and have continued community supervision strategies and continued access to addiction recovery care will do better and will recidivate less. Additionally, with the implementation of medication-assisted treatment at the Indiana Department of Correction, it is critical for continuity of care purposes that we continue to allow an offender and provide access to that offender to ongoing both medication and therapeutic treatment. You provide a critical role in making sure that happens. And finally, for communication purposes, we realized that oftentimes David or I individually would get emails about purposeful incarceration that would get buried in our inboxes as we researched individual issues. As a result, we've created the following email address, which is purposefulincarceration@idoc.in.gov. We ask that any and all inquiries about purposeful incarceration be sent to that email box. We hope that by doing it that way, David and I will be able to answer your questions much quicker and they won't get lost in the plethora of emails we receive about many other things during the day. We also will be providing this presentation and supplemental information such as cheat sheets and FAQs at the Department of Correction Addiction Recovery website, which is listed on your screen. Or you can go to the DOC's main website, select programs along the left-hand side of your screen, and then find addiction recovery services to access this information. At this time, we're going to open up for questions. Again, we'd like those questions to be submitted via the chat feature on your main bar control screen instead of over the phone. It looks like we have several questions, and I'm going to go through and review the questions and answers we've provided thus far, and then be glad to answer any additional questions that you submit along the way. The first question was, will this webinar be archived for later review for anyone who isn't in attendance? And the answer is yes, it will be on our website, or you can also email us at purposefulincarceration@idoc.in.gov if you have not found it or want additional access to it. Who decides that the offender has mastered the skills needed to complete the program? That is, each offender will have an individualized clinical treatment plan that dictates and articulates what competencies they need to demonstrate. This individualized treatment plan will be something that will be worked on with the individual addiction recovery specialist and the offender themselves. And as they work their way through their addiction recovery treatment plan and demonstrate those skills, both the offender and the addiction recovery specialist will work together to show that they move forward. Sorry, David. Let's make sure. Can you back one slide with the website? You bet. Let me go back one slide with the website for you. What is the Indiana code site for the statutorily ineligible offenses? The Indiana code is Indiana Code 35-38-1-17. Again, that's 35-38-1-17. And generally speaking, that code incorporates level 1 felonies and the most violent offenses, but you can look through that, or if you'd like to email Purposeful Incarceration email box, we can provide you with that code as well. Will the modifications to court be modified to CTP? That will be done on an individual court basis and on the availability of CTP in your individual county. I encourage you to discuss that at your county level and with your judges on what's eligible and what's available to them and whether or not CTP is one of those components. CTP is definitely one of those excellent strategies for reintegration into the community and modification of sentence for somebody who maybe had been purposefully incarcerated. Will there be recommendations made for community treatment upon release? The answer is yes. Each offender is working actively on a release recovery plan throughout the entirety of their incarceration period. They will be provided with that release recovery plan upon completion of treatment to take with them that helps dictate what they may need or may want to access upon release. I will say that our hope is that many of the offenders releasing who have successfully completed treatment will no longer need the community's most intensive modalities of treatment upon release. Instead, they will be accessing maintenance type therapies such as once or twice monthly individual treatment, 12-step recovery groups, and access to either primary care or ongoing care through their addiction recovery service provider in the community. We are getting lots of questions in here. What clinical assessments are you now using? We are currently using something called the SAI, or the Substance Abuse Intake. The Substance Abuse Intake is a hybrid of 2 assessments, and we will continue using those until we fully implement the DO-CR. They are just not as considered as valid and reliable at orchestrating severity of need, nor are they considered as prescriptive for helping us decide what modality of service the person should be in. They also don't help us parse out those who are just manipulating the answers. So in our new assessment tool, there's what's called a lie scale on it, and it helps us weed out those offenders who are using the tool to manipulate to get their needs met rather than answering honestly. Will community corrections programs receive the progress report or letters of completion? The progress reports and letters of completion will be given to the sentencing judge and the sentencing judge only. If community corrections needs additional information, they can email the Purposeful Incarceration at idoc.in.gov, and we will work to have that information supplied to you as well, as you are an arm of the court. What impact do you expect this to make on the waiting list at the facilities? Well, we hope this makes great impact, because in the past, offenders could only access one treatment modality, and that treatment modality was 8 months. So it really kind of put us in a holding pattern for that individual spot for 8 months. Now, offenders can access the most clinically appropriate treatment modality, which is not time limited, not time prohibited, and not bed space prohibited. So we do anticipate that we'll be able to serve more offenders and work through our wait list a little bit more appropriately as a result. How can probation and community corrections receive results from the DUCI as well as progress information prior to release so we can utilize this information in our own treatment plan? And this answer is similar to the one that I provided previously. If you need access to their completion information, we'll be able to provide that. If you need additional information, we may need to have a request of information or release of information signed by that offender. But upon release of information, we'll be able to release that HIPAA information. We do have some ideas in the future on how we can use the DUCI for our parolees as they remain Department of Corrections, under Department of Corrections supervision. But most certainly, if we can provide additional information and we can get that release of information, we will be glad to provide additionally ongoing information. How is the IDOC going to help rural counties with no or minimum Vivitrol providers? Great question. So we've already started to do this in many ways. First and foremost, with the hiring of Jason Harvey, he has gone out to many treatment providers throughout the state who traditionally have not been interested in providing MAT and specifically Vivitrol, and begun to form partnerships for in rural communities where this is not possible for them to receive an injection. The DOC will be releasing offenders with 30 days of the oral medication and a prescription for an additional 30 days that they can get filled at any pharmacy. So that gives them another 60 days of medication and us another 60 days to help find them an appropriate treatment provider. We also are linking them directly to Recovery Works upon release. So if an offender is releasing on MAT, they will automatically both get their Medicaid HIP 2.0 application, which is standard release procedures for all offenders, but those releasing from addiction recovery services will also get a Recovery Works referral to where they're releasing, in hopes that they can have stopgap insurance that will provide them continued treatment. I know that this does not increase access to providers in rural communities in the concrete way that really needs to happen. DOC is working actively with the Division of Mental Health and Division of Mental Health and Addiction and the Commission to Combat Drug Abuse to identify ways where we can increase access to care in rural communities, and we're committed to doing so. Unfortunately, there's no simple answer when we just need more people. How do you suggest the best process to assist the court with determining the need for RWI recommendation at sentencing, and what tools can be used? So in the past, we've provided simple screening tools that can be used that are not copyrighted, and the court can use these simple screening tools to indicate whether or not a person is likely to have a substance use disorder. We can continue to provide those tools should the court think that's necessary. But regardless of that, what we want you to know is you're not responsible for determining if somebody is appropriate for RWI or not. In fact, all we're asking you to do is make that recommendation and trust us to make that assessment and designation. And we will send communication if they are not appropriate after we've assessed them. Again, all DOC offenders, whether they've been identified as purposefully incarcerated, whether they've been identified of having a substance use disorder or not, will receive the substance use disorder screening tool at intake. And based on that score, will then be referred for further assessment. We only want you to designate those as purposefully incarcerated if the court is willing to consider a sentence modification upon successful completion. If the court would like to note that somebody has a substance use disorder but does not want them purposefully incarcerated because they will not consider a sentence modification, we most certainly appreciate and value that going in the abstract of judgment, that they want to ensure this person is evaluated for addiction recovery services. But from July 2017 on, we can assure you that every single offender is getting that screening tool and then appropriately referred for full assessment as they qualify. Not familiar with the doozy, is this available to see? So the doozy instrument itself is proprietary, meaning it's copyrighted. We can provide description information. It's available on the web by Googling it. And the doozy R version that DOC was developed by a company called eCenter Research. We can provide you overall reports of what the domains are and give you descriptors, but we can't give you the actual assessment. For those released on medication-assisted treatment, will there be referrals upon their release for continuation of treatment? Yes, absolutely. And in those cases where we've not been able to find a treatment provider prior to their release, Mr. Harvey attempts to continue to follow up with that released offender to find them treatment. He does not just give up on them. In one example, we had an offender released on MAT to CTP, and actually that offender was released before they were given their injection to CTP. And Mr. Harvey tracked that individual down, connected them with a treatment provider and a Recovery Works referral, and got them access to MAT. He's very committed to that process, and we're hoping to expand upon what he's doing. If a sentence is modified, can the court specify a release date? Yes, absolutely. The court can specify a release date. They can specify it for 10 years from now, 10 days from now, right now. But it's our recommendation that it not be any less than 30 days so that we can be sure that they have all the things they need for a more successful reentry. Do you only have one Jason Harvey? We do only have one Jason Harvey at this time. I think the DOC is exploring options to expand his role and expand opportunities for that. We also do continue to use our parole reentry liaisons when appropriate for this type of planning, but we are definitely hoping to expand on what Mr. Harvey is doing. Can the IDOC provide education to county jails on the importance of Vivitrol prior to release from jails? So that's a yes and no answer. We would be glad to talk about how it's impacting us and why we think it's so useful within the Department of Correction and how we're using it. If you want specific information about Vivitrol and its efficacy, I would encourage you to reach out to the makers and the providers of Vivitrol, as they really have way more information than we do. What I will say is that the Department of Correction does not just support Vivitrol as the singular MAT. We at the Department of Correction chose to only use naltrexone products due to issues with trafficking and continued trends for abuse within correctional facilities. It really leads to more violence with our facilities. But for those in the community who can attend community-based strategies for MAT, there are really 3 MATs that are appropriate for opiate addiction. And I would encourage the use of them when clinically appropriate for anybody. But we would be glad to talk about our release reentry program related to MAT and what that looks like at any jail or with any court system that wants to see what we've learned and why we're doing what we're doing. Did we miss any questions there? If you have questions that we missed or you want to send another question, please do so now before we end our webinar. And while you're submitting those, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for what you do in the community. You really provide vital supervision for people who need it and really ensure community safety and access to care and treatment. Without that access to care and treatment and continued supervision, what we're doing inside the walls with recovery while incarcerated and purposeful incarceration would not nearly be as successful. Again, as you have questions, as things come up, as you have opportunities for us to visit your county or your training, please feel free to reach out to us at purposeful.incarceration@idoc.in.gov. We'll maintain updated information on our website as well. And the information that we have on this website, we're hoping to get, or on this presentation, we're hoping to have on the website within the next week or so. Any other additional questions out there? Okay, at this time, again, thank you so much. We're going to conclude our webinar for today, and I look forward to working with you all in the future. Take care and have a great day.